So welcome everybody to the second day of the Cycle Touring Festival, and we are here with Chris and Liz Leakey, who did this incredible trip a few years ago, cycling home from New Zealand.
Hi, I'm Liz. I live with Chris and we're based in Manchester at the moment, but we've lived all over the place, including Cumbria. I don't have much more to say because I think we've got a lot of stories to share with you throughout the talk.
Yeah, the same. I think there's, I'm Chris Leakey and we're currently based in Manchester. And I think, most of what we want to say is going to come out in the talk. If we get interrupted by small children, that's just a normality of life and video calls at the moment.
So let's start sharing our screen. So we've titled this "Every Relationship Deserves a Bike Ride," and we've got a little bit of a Valentine's theme happening because, it was an adventure for us of cycling, but also of getting to know each other better and learning how to be a couple, I guess. So our story starts in 2005, where we met in New Zealand.
This had been my chat-up line for about 3 years. Would you like to cycle around the world with me? It wasn't working that well because most people that I used it on kind of ran away or thought I was a bit weird. And Liz was the first person not to run away. It turned out that she didn't think I was actually serious. I was going through a bit of a phase. I was quite into quantum physics, so I was trying to learn to walk through walls at the time. So cycling around the world probably wasn't too strange as part of the topics of conversations that we were having.
So Valentine's 2006, this is going back a bit, I realise, but Chris invited me to come up to the Lake District. I was living in London at the time, and I thought, yeah, great, it's going to be a lovely time, we're going to have a week together. And it turned out to be more of a kind of initiative test to see if I could pass sleeping in caves, walking up hills, cycling up to the Kirkstone Pass. And as someone that had basically done the most exercise dancing out in London rather than doing actual proper exercise, it was quite eye-opening. But I guess it gave us a good foundation for bringing our two worlds together, of you being very, very outdoorsy and me being, I guess, a London girl that liked just going out.
Yeah, well, I think for me, it was a realization that not everybody just walked up mountains and cycled everywhere on the weekend and did that in their holiday for fun. So that was a bit of a realization that we needed to flex to make everyone happy.
But it turned out I liked the Lake District enough, and we moved up there. And by about 2008, I realised that Chris was actually really serious about this cycling around the world. It wasn't just a chat-up line after all. So we had to really sit down and think about whether we were going to do it together or whether he was going to do it on his own. And so my idea was that we do a little bike trip to see if I actually like cycling enough. So we did John O'Groats to Land's End to see whether that would work.
Yeah, we did this in 2 blocks, 2 weeks and 2 weeks. And it was really just the first time that we'd cycled together. Liz had never really toured with panniers on before. I'd done a bit of touring through France. It was a really good chance to see whether or not we, I guess, functioned on the road together and would want to do this for a long time together.
I think I realised it wasn't just about cycling as well. It was the camping, the not having all your creature comforts necessarily, and just whether I could enjoy that, I suppose. Obviously I could handle it, but whether it was actually enjoyable. And
she said yes. It wasn't unenjoyable. So we started planning for a bigger trip. Originally I wanted to cycle around the world. But the compromise was that we'd fly to New Zealand and then cycle back. The theory being that it would be easier to not bail out if we'd started in
so
the
far
UK.
Away.
Yeah.
So yeah, September 2009, we put our bikes onto a plane and flew to New Zealand, and our plan was fairly wiggly, wasn't it?
Yeah, the route planning for this, we'd measured that we had a big map of the world on the wall, and we measured the distance of Land's End to John O'Groats, and then we basically replicated that distance along this line, and the line repeated itself 15 times. It had taken us 1 month to cycle Land's End to John O'Groats, so we assumed it would take 15 months to cycle this route, and we'd probably get a bit faster on the way, so we had a bit of flexibility. So the plan was to do this over 15 months. It didn't quite go to plan, but we still had a great time.
So we arrived into Auckland and we cycled down to Wanaka in the South Island over 3 months. And it was a really interesting start because obviously for those of you that have ever been to New Zealand, it's a pretty hilly place and not the easiest of training grounds or starting points. And I think what was interesting about that is we really wanted to have a shared experience as a couple. And actually it turned out that those first 6 weeks were really quite brutal for me, but really enjoyable for Chris. So we had quite a few times where he'd had a great day and I'd had a really hard day and was, not necessarily feeling that good about how hard I was finding it all. And so this idea, we had this sort of dream of this shared experience, but in those early days, it was actually really difficult to say that we were having a shared experience. I think we were both having our own experience, but it was very different. These are shots of the Rainbow Valley, which is in the north of the South Island, and it's a sort of 100-kilometre off-road route through mountains. Absolutely beautiful, but really hard to cycle on if you're not used to being off-road. And again, you've done some mountain biking, so you were quite comfortable. I, on the other hand, found it quite tricky just going down hills, trying not to skid, trying to learn to balance my weight, and having to haul your bike up some pretty tough terrain in places. So it was definitely a baptism of fire being in New Zealand to start with. Do you want to say a bit about the possum?
Yeah, if you've ever been to New Zealand, they've got a fantastic hut system in some of the rural areas, and we were delighted to find this hut. We didn't really have actually that much information about the huts on the route and what would be open, because technically it's closed to road vehicles during the time that we came across. But this was our first amusing wildlife encounter. There was quite a lot of noise going in the middle of the night, and it got to the stage where you're sort of in the middle of the night, no electricity, the middle of nowhere, and there's plenty of noise going outside, and your imagination's running wild. So eventually, I decided I had to go and investigate, and so I opened the door just a little bit, and I was greeted by an unexpected sight of a possum. And it was, literally less than a metre from my face, and its eyes were ginormous. And I think I let out the most interesting sound ever, and then burst into laughter when I realised what it was. But yeah, that was our first little encounter of wildlife, and the start of, I guess, some amusing stories.
Yeah, and it took us 3 days to get through the Rainbow Valley, but at the end of it, I think I had an appreciation of that idea of beautiful places are hard to reach. And as all of you that cycle tour know, that sometimes at the end of a journey, you actually appreciate it a lot more than maybe when you're in the thick of it and it's hard going, whether it's throwing it down with rain or it's hard gravel to cycle up. But it's definitely that sense of achievement and enjoyment. And this is probably the point where I started to really maybe get the bug and go, yeah, I think I can do this. I think it's going to be okay. That was one of the massive hills we came down. So then we flipped over to Australia, and again, we had 3 months. I'll let you just talk about that.
Yeah, Australia was different. It was much hotter, and we'd been talking about which route to take for quite some time. And I remember in the early days of planning that people were sort of saying, oh, you definitely can't cycle in the Northern Territory, it's just, there's nothing there and you'll die. And we were just looking at all sorts of options. I really wanted to cycle through the middle and go through the desert. I thought that would be the most interesting option. But we kind of, I guess, erred on the side of caution, and we went up the East Coast. And we're not massive planners. So we were a bit surprised, actually. We kind of, our picture of Australia was sort of flat and desert, and the East Coast is actually quite hilly and full of green gum trees. So there was a bit of a shock there. But yeah, we got used to it and we got into a groove. And yeah, the biggest, I guess, challenges for Australia were the heat more than anything else, just trying to stay hydrated. And then the wildlife, which everyone talks about. And we got used to this. And I think just for people that live in Australia, you kind of become accustomed to things. And not too worried about it. And I remember, I think the first night that we camped out, I was sort of doing giant like stompy steps through the long grass, just in case there were snakes, which now looking back on it seems really funny. But yeah, again, just when you're not used to something, it takes a while to kind of like become accustomed to it and then be comfortable with it. This is the trailer we bought in Australia. Part of the idea of this was that it would give me the chance to take a little bit more weight, so that Liz wouldn't be taking as much stuff, and this would hopefully even out our paces.
Yeah, that was a definite challenge, as Chris is almost 6 foot and really strong. I'm 5'4", and so even with all my best effort, I still was slower than him. So we definitely had a good chat about how to distribute the weight differently, perhaps just to try and slow Chris down a little bit, which was basically the challenge of my entire journey with Chris, was how do I slow him down? But I guess that is a challenge of couples cycling together if you don't have a tandem or a similar sizes and weights. So then we flew to Indonesia and landed in Bali, which for those of you that have visited is completely different to Australia and New Zealand. It was definitely a culture shock, but in a really nice way. It was colourful, vibrant, you know, much more rustic, very beautiful. And we had 2 months there in Bali. We hopped over to Lombok for a little bit and then also went to Java. And I guess one of our worries about cycle touring was what happens if the bike breaks? Can we get people to fix it? But it turns out everywhere you go in the world, there are people that know how to fix bikes. Bikes are actually a main mode of transport for many countries, unlike here, where it's perhaps seen more as, in the UK, where it's perhaps seen more as a leisure activity. A lot of people rely on bikes as their main mode of transport. So that was no problem. And obviously people were quite interested every time the two of us rocked up and needed some help. We met other cyclists along the way as well. And I think the highlight of Indonesia was, you know, the food and all the, just the richness of the culture and how different it was to the things we'd seen in New Zealand and Australia. You know, kids swimming in a river, things you perhaps wouldn't see so much in the UK. We had quite a few encounters with various police, particularly if we were finding it difficult to find somewhere to camp. They were often really helpful and slightly bemused or bewildered by what we were doing, I think, because camping in Indonesia is not really a thing. Which leads us on to this particular story, which Chris is going to tell you, one of our favourite stories.
Yeah, we'd met a guy in a hostel, a local Indonesian guy, and he'd helped us learn a lot of Bahasa, and so we had quite a few set phrases. We tried very hard throughout the bike trip to learn as much of the local language as possible, because we believed that it gave a richer experience. And we'd been looking for a place to camp all day, and it was just surrounded by paddy fields, which is sort of, you know, basically sort of waterlogged, and there was nowhere to camp. So we pulled off the side of the road, and we ended up in this little village, and we just sort of said, hey, is it okay to put the tent up here? And everyone was like, you can't possibly sleep in a tent, you know, you'll get wet, it's not waterproof, it's too flimsy, so come and sleep in our house. And yeah, Liz was whisked off by the ladies, and I was left sort of talking to people, and we hadn't eaten at this stage, so I said, oh, we need to cook some food and start eating. And that night we'd bought food to make nasi goreng, which is the national dish of Indonesia, basically. So I was now essentially in front of about the village of 30 or so people, children, and everyone was watching me cooking the national dish, which was quite intimidating. And I think one of the dads said afterwards that this was the most engaged that the kids had been, and it was better than television. About halfway through, some of the women in particular were sort of like, I think, curious at my technique for cooking the national dish. So I had to adapt halfway through, and I just sort of said, oh, this is nasi goreng English style. And everyone went, oh, and it was fine after that, and I could do what I wanted with it. However, halfway through, some of the beans that we'd had for the meal, a lady just took them off me and said that we couldn't eat them because they were old and they'd just been sweaty from being in a pannier bag all day. And it was fine, and we had a great night there. They had a sort of party, well, I think in the house that we were accommodated in, and we went to bed a bit early. Actually, we were quite tired. And the next morning, everyone in the village was lovely. They gave us bottled water and wished us on our way. And then one lady came out and gave us some fresh beans because they'd taken the beans off us the night before, and we went on our way. And yeah, I mean, just Indonesia was a lovely place, and the people were so friendly and helpful. And I think it was one of the places that it really struck a chord with me, that because when you're cycling, you don't stay in the main tourist places, you get to experience the life in between, which is that cliche that everyone wants to experience the culture. But I really felt that in Indonesia, you got to experience much more on a bike than you would ever do just backpacking or bus traveling.
Mm-hmm. And actually everyone in this photo looks a bit miserable, but that's just Indonesians don't smile or show their teeth on photos, like quite a lot of other cultures as well. But yeah, they were actually very joyous, and we had a great time with them and felt really welcomed by this village despite our language barrier. And everywhere we went, actually, when we stopped, we would often find, particularly children gravitate towards us and want to learn more about what we were doing. Whizzing through, because obviously there's a lot of stories we could tell about a 2-year trip. We took a boat from Jakarta to Singapore, and then we were heading into Malaysia. And we had 2 weeks effectively, because we were going to meet with Chris's dad in the north of Malaysia. So Malaysia was interesting. It was probably my least favorite part of the trip. I found it extremely hot. Just the temperatures were pretty much out of my, beyond my threshold of what I can cope with, really, as someone that just struggled with anything above sort of 36. We were in the 40s, and it was just very difficult and almost melted our clothes in the process from the amount of sweating. And actually the journey, the roads are fantastic, but we saw a lot of these palm plantations. So a lot of the view was very similar, because for miles and miles, you just see palm and not much else. And what we decided to do actually in the end was to get up super early to avoid the heat and cycle when it was cooler, and then stop and have a really, really long lunch break for about 4 hours until it cooled down again, which meant it actually made a really long day because we had this big gap in the middle. But we had some amazing food as a result of stopping at sort of roadside cafes for 3 or 4 hours and hanging out with some of the locals. But this is one of the sunsets, so it's pretty spectacular to wake up that early at sort of 5 a.m. and see these amazing sort of tropical, dawns, I guess, of the sun coming up. I did actually spend a lot of time trying to figure out the salt and sugar ratio that could go in my Camelback, so that I could try and keep my headaches at bay, because I had the most terrible headaches during the day just from trying to stay hydrated. But I know other people have loved Malaysia, and the food is exceptional with the blend of Malaysian and Chinese cooking coming together. And like I say, the roads are great. So if you're hardy enough to cope with the temperatures, we definitely recommend Malaysia, and it'd be nice to go back and spend more time. Yeah. We didn't really get a chance to experience the culture much, did we? So.
I think what was interesting was it was the first time that we had a time scale and we were rushed a little bit, and I think that was quite different to how we've been traveling usually. And that detracted from being able to stop and enjoy and some of the things that we would have normally done, perhaps.
Yeah. And the reason for our deadline is we were meeting up with Chris's dad, who happened to be sailing around the world at the same time and was in Thailand. And so we decided we would come aboard and basically sail up to Thailand from Malaysia and have a month on the boat with your dad and
my younger brother and sister, who I think were like 6 and 4 at the time.
So that was a good adventure as well. And then after that month on the boat, we arrived into Thailand, into Krabi. And we actually had 5 months in Thailand because we stopped to teach English for 3 months. But for those of you that have ever been to Thailand, it's a really lovely place to go. I know this photo looks a bit hectic, but once you get used to that kind of 360-degree traffic, as we call it, and learn how to sort of hold your own, it's actually really pleasant. Great roads, lovely food, lovely people. Probably one of our most favourite places, actually, Thailand, because it just felt very easy as a place to tour. And by now we were completely used to these hot temperatures. So again, we were more acclimatized to the climate. Amazing food, we had lots of sort of street side food. Hostels were really cheap as well. So we didn't camp that much in Thailand. And you got amazing sights just behind these trucks of, monkeys and coconuts and everything you'd expect. and all sorts of different vehicles as well along the way, and just randomly passing temples along the way. Whereas we felt like people went to Bangkok to go and see the big palaces and temples, but we saw so many on the road. I think by the time we got to Bangkok, we were almost templed out, weren't we? Which is a bit of a shame.
Yeah, we met a guy on a train. We'd done a sort of side trip once, and he was amazed that we hadn't been to see this temple. And yeah, it was hard to explain that we'd just seen so many temples. And the only way to explain it was like you wouldn't necessarily go through England going to every single church that you seen. And but yeah, it was an interesting sort of like realization about the differences between, I guess, styles of travel.
Yeah. And actually, again, the language barrier didn't necessarily stand in our way. I often felt a really strong connection with the women that I met as I traveled. They were often very surprised to see me on the road with Chris. And that natural sort of nurturing took over. Like, they wanted to always give me food and water and sort of look after me. Either they thought it was just bonkers that I was actually doing this, or they thought I was really strong and were kind of like really impressed.
And they'd also asked you where our children were.
Oh yeah, they were constantly asking us if we were married and why we weren't at home just having babies, basically, which was a little bit wearing after a while, but also quite sweet as well. That was more their kind of expectation, I guess, of a couple. Just a nice food shot of all the food markets. And then we reached Chiang Mai, and we were working with our charity for 3 months up in the mountains teaching English. I'll let you say.
Yeah, so as part of the trip, we were trying to raise some money to build a school, and we raised about just over £5,000 in the end, which went towards building a school with the charity Child's Dream. And one of the original projects that they set up was in this village called Tomato Village, and it was basically an English school that was set up by a guy called Ben, or Uncle Ben, and he was originally from Burma, but came across to Thailand during the war years, and was basically lived in the sort of the mountains on the border for a long time, and before sort of settling up in the mountains. And there's lots of I guess like sort of hill tribe people that live up in the mountains up there. And he'd grown up in a sort of missionary school, and so actually could speak pretty good English. And so he was started a little English school, and the Child's Dream helped by building more infrastructure on his land to build a couple of classrooms. And so we ended up spending quite a few months, like 3 months at this place teaching English, and having a bit of a rest from cycling, which was nice. It was a really nice experience, and getting to, I guess, understand a little bit more about the local culture, and particularly like how the hill tribe people live, and sort of what their expectations about the future were. And I think what we realized was that being able to speak English gave them options, and I think that was what we wanted to kind of give, like it's sort of quite cliche really, but to sort of say, oh yeah, you must go move to the city or sort of lead a certain path, but the kids were very dedicated, and I think they saw the value in having that option, being able to speak English. And they would go to school during the day, and then come to the English classes 2 or 3 times a week
in the evening. We were also really fortunate because Ben had lived in the forest basically for 2 years and learnt to how to survive basically, and that him and his son would do like hill trekking into the forest and take tourists, and they actually really wanted to set up a business doing that. So they took us on a trek, and we built this shelter out of bamboo, and bamboo is such a versatile material that they were able to make everything out of it, the entire structure. We had banana leaves for the roof. They also used it, they hollowed it out and then used it to cook rice. They knew which mushrooms were safe to eat and which weren't. Like, they just knew the forest in a way that we don't, unfortunately, know our forests quite as well. They made fire just, and then cooked on it. And it was a really great experience. And so we decided to help them, because I'm a web designer. So we basically built them a website, and so that they could advertise to tourists coming through that area to actually come up into the mountains and go for a sort of trek with them, so that they could start to spin up that business. So that was quite a nice thing for us to have been able to do, just to give something back to them, because we basically lived with them for 3 months, and yeah, they were very hospitable and looked after us.
Yeah, and the website's still live, Ben10 Trekking. So if you ever when travel restrictions are eased, if you end up in Thailand, do go and have a trek with them. It's you can learn a lot. Okay,
so we then entered into Laos, which was really interesting. If any of you have been, it's a bit like stepping back in time. There are still horses and carts. It's a lot very traditional, and beautiful scenery, very unspoiled. Lots of big hills to climb up, but empty roads. I mean, there wasn't really much traffic, and you just cycle for miles through this, almost like a nature reserve effectively, but it is just their landscape. And everywhere we went, the children would come out to greet us. Some children were in school, but many were not. A lot of them would work with their families in the fields, very sort of traditional way of life. But we definitely got a lot of shouts and greetings whenever we went past them, which was lovely. Obviously, like I said earlier, lots of people also use bicycles, not just us. So whilst people were surprised to see us sometimes, we also did see a lot of people cycling around, including the monks. And we were comfortable enough to sort of make these sort of roadside, stops, and actually stayed the night here. This was like a shelter that had already been constructed. And we decided to just see if we could just hang out here for the night, and that worked out well.
Well, this was the Hornet story, which we'd had a bit of a bad day the night before. Do you want to tell the Hornet story?
Okay, yeah. So we stopped to camp on the side of the road at this sort of just clearing, and as you can imagine, because it's still quite hot in Laos, and we weren't really getting to stop and shower or wash very much. So we'd had a makeshift shower with our water bladder, and we'd got into bed, but I'd hung up all of our clothes inside the tent just to let them air a little bit and dry out. And the next morning we woke up to a buzzing sound, and the whole of the inner tent, not the bit we were sleeping in, but the porch area of our Hillybird tent, was completely full of hornets, probably 150 hornets that were pretty big. And we'd actually been watching David Attenborough's Planet Earth, and there'd been a whole section about hornets on it and how they were really dangerous. So yeah, we were slightly trapped in our tent, where we figured out how we'd be able, because we couldn't get out because they were blocking the door and they were all over the inner tent.
Well, and all our clothes were actually where the hornets were, because it was so hot. We were basically sleeping in our underwear, and
so we had no protection at all. So we had to come up with a plan for how we would actually evacuate and get out, and whether we did like slow moving astronaut style, or whether we could try and pull some clothes through and get dressed. So, but yeah, that was quite interesting. And I guess we felt a little bit vulnerable because we were miles from anywhere. And even if we had been close to somewhere, the medical facilities could have been a little bit limited. So that took us about 2 hours to get out of the tent, but we actually came out unscathed.
Yeah.
No stings, and were able to go on our way. So that was an interesting one.
Right.
And I actually developed quite a passion for map reading along this journey. You tended to be just quite happy to bumble along, and if I asked you where we were, sometimes you wouldn't necessarily know. But I got really fascinated with the paper maps and had one folded up on my bar bag, and would also study them in the evenings just to understand where we're going next. I definitely needed to know like the sense of where we're going and where we're trying to get to. And it's that balance between the destination and enjoying the journey. We were fortunate enough to meet up with Margot and Ben, who they'd set off at a similar time from Scotland. Sorry, they're from Scotland, but they'd set off to do a similar journey, and we'd been following their blog, but we'd never met them. And we actually managed to meet up with them in Laos, which was great to sort of swap stories and hear about the adventures that they'd had so far, and have a bit of downtime as well. And then we went into China, which is almost like an entire story in its own right, but we'll try and whiz through. Laura, do you want us to take a few Q&A questions before we get into the second half?
Yeah, we can do. Do you want me to ask? I can put a couple of questions to you now, if you like.
Yeah, go on then.
Okay. So the first one, which is an easy one, is that when's your book being published? Because you've got a great story to tell.
We have talked about doing it. We wrote a really good blog, and yeah, it's one of those things that we should probably do before we forget too much of the adventure. Thank you.
The next question is, how do you cope with the language barrier in remote places? And I've long thought about doing a session at the festival actually on kind of communicating without language, but perhaps you could talk about how you guys coped with it.
Yeah, I like this question. I love languages, and I guess that helps. And I don't know if I'm lucky or whatever, but I enjoy the communication. And what I think was interesting with that I discovered was that that it doesn't have to be perfect to communicate well. And actually you can learn quite a lot with just a few small phrases like where is, can I have, and like numbers are important because you need to pay for things, and depending on which country you have to learn 1 to 100 or 1 to 1 million, depending on how many zeros are on the end of the currency. But I think that one of the sort of the explanations I have is like Liz did German at school, and but was always, I guess, concerned about using that German because the German people spoke English so much better, and it was just like you couldn't make it perfect. Whereas actually, I think that in some of the countries like our Bahasa we were communicating more there than we'd ever done in Germany.
I think it was quite liberating to go to countries where you had no expectation of yourself to know the language, compared to when you've studied for 5 years and ought to know it really well. To just rock up somewhere and go, well, I'm just going to do my best here. And it's more about, I need to get some water, or I need to buy this food, or I need to get a spare tire. I think necessity is a big driver of learning language because you don't really have a choice. And it's about communication rather than being perfect at a language. So it's quite different to how we sort of do languages at school, I think. And like I say, I definitely enjoyed it a lot more. So
yeah, and I think part of it I think is like people are aware of the kind of concept of growth mindset as well. That it's like Chinese. Everyone's like, oh, you can't learn Chinese; it's far too hard. And my Chinese was very basic, but I had some really cool conversations with Chinese people, and with the limited amount of Chinese that I have, and it went such a long way, particularly in China. To have those communications, and more so in China, and I'll come to more of that actually later on.
Okay, so obviously, as I said, China's a big story, but we'll share a few things with you. So we passed into
Liz. I'm sorry to interrupt. You've got at least 3 questions, possibly 4, about the hornet's nest. So do you mind rewinding to that? To sum it up, is how did you escape the hornets in the end? So perhaps you can complete that story.
So, well, I think it was a kind of like a combined approach. The hornets seemed to be a little bit docile, like they weren't like moving fast. So I think Liz's sort of combination of the sort of slow moving robot style. We had mosquito coils that we were burning, so we managed to sort of like put one arm out and sort of fish things out, and eventually very very slowly I basically retrieved all of my clothes from the porch, and we lit the mosquito coils, and then again really slowly just sort of like try not to sort of make too much disturbance. I managed to get out with enough clothes on that I was sort of reasonably protected. I sort of had my buff, up to my neck and eyes and so on. And then opened the main door of the tent, and just kept those mosquito coils going. But it still took them a long time. They were sort of almost a little like they were drunk or something, and they were just very docile. I've no experience with hornets. I'm not an expert, but that's how we got out. So I think we were just patient.
You were patient. The hardest thing for me was that, probably like a lot of people, I wake up in a tent and the first thing I need to do is go for a wee, and couldn't do that. So it was a very long wait while I was desperate for the toilet. So I was actually more focused on that than the hornets at times, I think.
One other quick question before you move to China. There are a lot of other questions have come in, but just because this relates to what you talked about, is the trekking company, was it tenandbentrekking.com?
Yeah, I think we need to double check. I know that they've had the website's changed a few times since we've set it up. Someone else is sort of taking it over.
We can post it on Facebook afterwards, though, if that's helpful.
And they have a Facebook page as well. So, and in some ways that might be easier for them. For you to get in touch.
It's all about Facebook now, 10 years later, rather than websites, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I'll leave you to carry on with China. Okay. I'll put myself back on mute.
Thanks, Laura. So we crossed into Mengla, which is just a border town that's very unknown, I guess. And we wanted somewhere to stay the night, and we asked for a cheap hotel, and this is where we ended up.
Yeah, we were sort of amazed at the luxury of this, because we'd not stayed in anything this good for ages, and it was relatively cheap actually. Yeah. It was the first night in China, and it was quite a culture shock, because we stayed here, but then we'd eaten out in a restaurant where everyone just ate food and then threw the bones and bits and pieces on the floor. And we were just sort of a bit like unsure about what to do, and we were putting our food on the table next to it, and then at the end of the meal they just came and just swept everything off the table onto the floor. And it sounds like we could have called it the Henry VIII kind of banquet, but it was actually quite efficient, because the bits that they didn't want, they just swept up with the dustpan and brush, and then there was stuff that was on the table would be washed or whatever. But I guess, yeah, it was quite a contrast. There was lots of big contrasts in China.
Yeah, it was definitely a culture shock. The first week as well was quite challenging, and almost the point where you're like, I don't know if I'm going to enjoy this place. And interestingly, we hadn't planned. We were almost not going to go to China, because partly because of the human rights, and we were just like, is it okay to go somewhere where the government is so bad? Like, are we supporting them somehow by coming here as tourists? But I think we felt like we've only seen the Western news about China. Let's go and visit for ourselves and actually see it for ourselves. I think we're so glad we did. Despite our first week being quite challenging, it turned out to be one of our most favourite places. And amazing roads. I mean, you'd expect China to have great roads, but the infrastructure there is phenomenal. They have these big tunnels though, which you have to cycle through, which can last for sort of 2-3 kilometres, which are quite hairy to cycle through because the speed of the traffic. And you could cycle on this pavement bit, but they weren't always complete, and you just suddenly find that there's a massive hole, or they'd just not be they wouldn't be completed. A bit like the cycle pass in the UK sometimes. So that was quite challenging and a bit hairy at times to navigate those. And there was often no alternative but to go through them. And yeah, I mean, the landscape in China was phenomenal. I mean, you sort of think of China perhaps as being quite industrial because of the media that we see, but it's absolutely beautiful. And you'd cycle for 100 kilometers through a nature reserve and just be surrounded by beautiful scenery and wildlife. And then you come into the big cities where, a small city is about 10 million people, but again, very organized, exactly what you'd expect of China, but lots and lots of different types of traffic. And but I don't think we ever felt particularly unsafe, did we, in China?
No, I mean, always, really nice. Yeah, felt very safe in China actually. And we were talking about the language thing. It was the one country where actually being able to speak a little bit made a huge difference. And yeah. We usually bought a SIM card in every country. And when the first day I went into the shop to buy a SIM card, and somebody sort of said, "Oh, how can I help you?" And I was like, "Oh, this is brilliant. They can speak English." And after that, the girl behind the counter just burst out laughing and then just hid behind the counter because that was the only English she could talk. And then we've subsequently found out that sign language and body language don't work that well. So being able to communicate with a little bit of language was really important. But yeah. You can talk about the food.
I mean, Chinese food. I mean, obviously we have Chinese restaurants in the UK, but actual Chinese food is quite different in terms of, well, it's amazing and really flavoursome, but it's not sort of like sweet and sour and black bean sauce and the kind of things that you might order from a takeaway. It's much more rustic and perhaps less of those really strong flavours, but lots of garlic and lots of, spring onion. And noodle soup was like just a normal thing to have for breakfast. And when it was cold, just having these amazing, but I mean, I literally miss having noodle soup for breakfast. It's that good. If you ever go, I can recommend, if you only have one thing, have some noodle soup for breakfast.
It does depend on what region you're in, because there's quite a lot of difference from each region.
Yeah. And we also met with Margot and Ben and cycled with them for quite a bit through the south of China, through the lower parts of the Chinese country. Again, meeting children everywhere we go, fascinated by bicycles. I think we had lots of really warm welcomes wherever we went. The Chinese people are some of the kindest, nicest people you could ever meet.
Our sort of summary of China was that the people and the government are two separate things, really. And when you try and talk to politics to the everyday person, it's just was almost like a non-concept, and just people were just, I felt really genuine, and when we came through lots of towns, they were just like so honoured, I guess is the best word, that we'd chosen their town to come through. I mean, it was pretty arbitrary, like we'd just chosen that route, but we were always treated very, very, very kindly.
Yeah, there is an interesting thing in China though, where nobody wants to really say no to you or to lose face by saying they don't know. So we'd have these quite interesting times when you'd stop in the middle of nowhere to ask about, with like a fork in the road, like which road should we take, because there'd be no signposts. And we'd ask, you know, is it this way? And they'd say yes. And then we'd say, is it this way? And they'd say yes. And you're like, okay. But they just don't want to say no to either question or say that they don't know. So often asking for directions didn't really work, because yeah, they were more eager to please you by giving them an answer rather than just saying, look, we don't know what you're doing or where you're going. So that was interesting. That was a photo of one of those occasions. Lots of just very rustic, you know, a lot of the parts of China we went through are still very agriculturally heavy, lots of farming, just, you know, a massive sea of ducks walking down the road, donkeys still being used. And then we arrived into Dali after a really long day, our longest day, in fact, of 109 kilometers, which I know isn't long by lots of people's standards, but for me, that was my longest day and I was pretty proud. And it also involved climbing a lot of hills. And the shadow that's taken there was us hitting our 9,000 kilometer mark. And then we arrived into Dali a few hours later in the dark, coming down a very steep hill in the dark, which was a little bit of a white knuckle ride. But then came into this beautiful place that is almost like what you'd picture sort of traditional China to look like, with the lanterns and the waterways and beautiful shops. It was like an oasis, really.
Yeah, I mean, it is a manicured town.
Yeah.
I mean, the local government pride themselves on making it look like this deliberately.
Yeah.
And they've actually had quite strict conditions for shops and businesses to do certain things. And I was in a cafe once, and everyone had to run down and take their signs off the side of the wall, because the local police were coming down to sort of do an inspection to make sure everyone was unified and fitting in with the theme.
So I'd made the decision actually to go home for a couple of months, because we've been on the road for 15 months, which was the time we'd kind of agreed. And it was the longest I'd been away from my family. My brother had had his second baby, and we'd left just after he'd had his first baby. So I was sort of missing out a little bit on big family events of seeing my niece and nephew. So I decided to go home for 3 months, and your plan was then to go up into the mountains, along the Tibetan border. But Chris kind of sprung a surprise on me just before I flew home, didn't you?
Yeah, I guess like part of the bike trip for me was that going way back to asking someone, do you want to cycle around the world with me, was I always thought that it would be a good test of any relationship, and if we could do that, then we'd probably be okay for the rest of our lives together. And Liz didn't know, but I mean, I've been thinking about proposing to Liz for quite some time, and it was just like where to do it, you know, the sort of iconic places or times and everything else. And originally I planned to do it in the Gobi Desert. I thought that would be quite romantic. Maybe not everyone's idea of romantic place, but anyway. But yeah, with Liz going home, and yeah, it was going to be a few months, and I didn't want to wait any longer. I wanted to let her know really that yeah, she was the person that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. And so yeah, in Dali, I proposed to Liz, and she said yes. So that was lucky.
Yeah, and I guess we both have quite fond memories of China as a result, even more fond than they were already. So then you had an amazing adventure up in the mountains in the winter, which in all honesty, I'm not sure I would have found as enjoyable, just because of the level of hardship and pushing bikes up 7 kilometers of ice. Might have been a bit of a stretch for me to not have had a sense of humour failure on a daily basis. But you've got some stunning photos and great stories to tell us.
Yeah, I mean, this whole section when I was on my own in China was it was quite memorable for me. A lot of personal challenge. Originally, when Liz was going to go back home, I thought, oh, I can cycle all the way through up to Beijing. That was my challenge. But we met a French couple in the south of China, and they said, oh, you should go to the mountains over here because it's really hard, but really interesting. And I thought, well, that sounds like a challenge. So rather than going for that kind of like, I must cover lots of distance and cycle everything, I decided to go for the experience. And yeah, it was a great challenge. I guess the two things that stood out were the snow and the ice, and this is starting to learn to, I guess, be comfortable in these conditions, and it to not be like out of your comfort zone. And I was in my comfort zone most of the time for this, except for the bears. I had one section, and there was essentially between two towns, and the maps were pretty sketchy, so I wasn't exactly sure on the route, but there were two peaks around about 4,000 meters between the two. And I think the little town that I passed sort of in between the two peaks, people were quite surprised to see me. I'd met some guys along the way, and I sort of said, oh, do I need to worry about the bears? Because I'd seen a bear print, what I presume was a bear print in the snow, and they're like, oh no, it's absolutely fine. And then, but I was still worried, and I met these two guys on the side of the road going up one of the passes, and they had this little bottle of alcohol, which I think was like 52% proof. So we shared that together, and it was the first night that I'd slept in a while without being worried about the bears because I was so drunk. And anyway, the next day I got up, went up this pass, and then down again into this village, and then I sort of was talking to people about the bears again, and I said, oh, do I need to worry? And then I was kind of getting over it at this stage, and then a guy sort of said, oh, have you got a gun? I was like, why do I need a gun? He said, oh, protect yourself from the bears. So I was like, right, I made myself a mission. I was like, I'm definitely going to get to the top of this next pass, and just not sleep out with the bears tonight. And which was amusing because I'd been reading Bill Bryson's book about him being scared of bears, and I thought he was being a bit of a wuss, but actually being in that situation, and I've got plenty of stories about the bears, and been worried about it. But this was coming down, I think, the next day, and in the end I didn't get to the top of this peak. I just sort of ran out of time. There was a storm that came in, and I think there's a couple of pictures before, I think it was. This one here. So this is just before the pass, basically. And then the next day I couldn't cycle up the pass because there was too much snow. So it took me the whole day to walk and push the bike up, and then come down the other side again. Again, it was just one of those times where like not rushing and just sort of knowing it was going to take a long time. And I actually look back on it with fun memories, even though it was hard.
I'm going to whiz on because I'm conscious we haven't got much time, and we've probably got more than an hour's worth of content here, unfortunately. So actually I came back and we met up in Chengdu, which obviously was a little bit of an adjustment for us to come back together again after 3 months where I'd been back in London, working back at the BBC for 3 months, freelancing, seeing family, and you've been up in the mountains having a bit of a tough time, but also, having quite an adventure. We then took a train up to Xi'an and up to Beijing because of visas and time that we actually have in China. And our next mission was to go up into Outer Mongolia and through the Gobi up to Ulaanbaatar. We obviously want to share a bit with Mongolia with you because that's quite out there. This is us in the Gobi. And I'd actually come back with a different tent for us so that we had one that was sand friendly. And we were looking forward to these like vast open, these wild landscapes with nothing. And we certainly got that. It was really remote. I guess that's why it's called Outer Mongolia, and it is a desert. But actually there was a track all the way through, it wasn't just pure sand. There is actually a hard track. We were carrying a lot of water and a lot of food. We had, supplies for about 7 days. But as you can see, there's literally nothing. And I found that quite hard, actually, just the nothingness, nothing to see, nothing, not even a flower. And when we did finally come across flowers, it was really nice just to have that bit of colour injected. And we got trapped in a tent for 2 days when this sandstorm blew in. And it was a bit like how I'd imagine being on Mars or the moon. It was just slightly crazy. That was a round tent, and actually the wind was blowing it in so much that it almost sand just got everywhere, didn't it? But I think you had that phrase, which is it's going to take a lot of beach holidays for Liz to like sand again. Not just a sandstorm, but also there were patches where you'd hit quite thick sand and have to drag your bike through it for quite a long time, which was, as you can imagine, quite exhausting. yeah, it was just an incredible location there. I mean, even though I found it really tough, you quite enjoyed it. We had quite different experiences there.
I love the desert, and actually I was surprised at how populated it was. There's quite a lot of through traffic, so I didn't actually feel worried that much, because you saw at least one vehicle a day, and it's about 6 from the Mongolian Chinese border out to Ulaanbaatar, which is a big city. It's about 600 kilometers, and there's sort of a supply town every 200 kilometers before you reach Ulaanbaatar. And yeah, I guess we've done. Our approach was that we'd sort of, be prepared for everything. As you can see, we've got a lot of stuff, and we had like 25 liters of water when we set off from the border. And yeah, I'd sort of been thinking that I should probably try this before we set off to see if it's possible. And the first day we tried it was the day that we left the border town, and it worked. We were pretty fortunate that it all came together. And but in the first section that was 200 kilometers, there was a small supply town kind of halfway through, which we weren't really sure what was there. And we had enough food not to worry if we missed it, but we did miss it entirely. It was just the tracks kind of that the trucks were taking. They didn't really need to go to that town because it was too short a distance for them. So we were collecting camel poo and pretending that if we didn't get our cup of tea, that we'd probably die in the desert. And, yeah, but it would have just been dramatic, taking the piss out of Bear Grylls a bit.
It turns out that the Gobi is actually much better designed for horses than for bikes, no surprise. And we did encounter, a fair amount of people living out in yurts and people on horses. And we got this amazing photo right outside our tent, just as this man had had a cigarette with us and a coffee, and then he got on his horse to go away, and the horse reared up, and we got this amazing shot where the horse is almost completely off the ground.
Well, they'd seen us arrive at night, and I guess they were sort of 500 meters or so away in a gare in the middle of nowhere, and then in the morning they'd come over to sort of say hello,
check us out,
and we had a chat. It was nice.
And actually, this is one of the areas where we could both get quite exhausted from the cycling. And just on a relationship note, I think it's really interesting when both of you are tired, that one of you is slightly more tired, and then the other one has to sort of step up and you get the tent up, get some food on. And even though, like on a normal day, that level of tiredness would have stopped you, because the other person is so exhausted and almost a bit broken, you suddenly get this energy from nowhere to actually like look after the other person and step up almost. And I think we both had to do that on different occasions, where one of us was pretty tired or hungry or cold or whatever, and the other one had to step in. And I think that sort of made us a really good team, actually, and has stood us in good stead for the future with having children and everything else that life throws at you, even back in the UK. One of my favorite photos, just looking, surveying the scene. And then the first flower, the purple flowers. I was so delighted to see this flower that I literally shouted to you, got off the bike, got the camera out, took a photo of a flower because I was so pleased to see some colour. Again, amazing hospitality along the way. And we actually had really good food, despite being in the desert. There were the couple of stops we had. They had fresh meat, fresh vegetables. We managed to cook up a beef stew in the middle of the desert. I also had to take apart our laptop at one point because the sand was stopping us from blogging, just to try and clear it out a bit and help us get back onto the blog as we were going along. A lot of hauling the bike and pushing it in places, which I definitely had a few tantrums about and stormed off a few times across the desert.
Mostly the desert was actually like relatively compact, but occasionally you just hit like a patch of like loose sand, and then the bike would just come to a stop.
Like cycling in a sandpit, basically. We did a bit of outdoor sleeping as well, where it was possible, where there's an interesting sort of rocky outbreak. Bit of bivvying, which I've never been a huge fan of, but you were always really keen, so whenever it felt like a good option, we'd do it. And then finally we arrived into Ulaanbaatar and got ourselves a nice beer, and sort of reaching civilization was so different after 21 days in the desert and quite well earned, I felt.
Yeah, I think we'd met a couple at the border, and they were traveling through the desert, and Liz was like, oh, it's taking us so long, and she kind of was a little bit, I guess, disheartened about the time it was taking us to do this trip. But when we eventually found out sort of later that the Swiss people who were cycling much faster than us their tent had broken in that sandstorm that we were in, and so they had to like stop and get the train back into Ulaanbaatar and finish. And then there was another guy who we'd met at the border, a local guy who was a deaf Mongolian guy who was into cycling, and he wanted to cycle part of the trip, the desert with us. And he ended up catching up with us about a third of the way through. And again, Liz was like, how did you do that? And then it took us almost like 2 weeks to to get the communication right. But he'd actually taken a train and a truck most of the way to kind of catch up with us. So yeah, it was. I think it was a good realization for Liz actually that she was okay at cycling, and there was, you know,
okay at persevering.
Yeah, because I think you were just worried that you weren't good enough, and because everyone else was going faster, and it was not about the speed; it was just about keeping going. And I think that was an important lesson.
Yeah, I'm just whizzing through some of the photos that after Ulaanbaatar we went across. Basically towards the Chinese border, and these are just some of the amazing photos of the scenery and the beauty of Mongolia and the people. Yeah, and it was quite, I mean, if you want an adventure, go to Mongolia. It's pretty out there as a place. It's you know, there's not a lot of supplies. There are shops, but it's very basic. It's really, yeah, probably if you want something more extreme, Mongolia is the place to head. And there's people everywhere, you know, because they are nomadic and they still live in their yurts, but and there are towns as well. But yeah, we definitely experienced the hospitality, but we also had a few problems with things being stolen and a little bit of shady. Didn't always feel 100% safe at times, but it was definitely a great place to have an adventure. And just if you like open spaces, you're going to get masses and masses and masses of open space where you literally don't see anything for hours apart from these amazing sort of majestic hills and mountains.
Well, just before, I think one of the challenges of Mongolia was that our Mongolian wasn't very good, and we sort of skipped this, but we spent a couple of months teaching English in Mongolia at a local school, and so actually we were spending more time teaching English than we were learning Mongolian, and I think that made a difference to some of the communication issues that we had, and it would. I guess it's my one regret for Mongolia that we didn't learn enough Mongolian to sort of to I guess interact more with people.
Yeah. Laura, can we carry on for another 5 minutes? I realise we're over time now. She hasn't said no yet.
Yeah, absolutely can. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, can I just talk about the border crossing?
Yeah.
Just before we, well, the Mongolia to China border crossing was quite a big thing because I'd been looking at it for about a year. And when we were in Mongolia, we were trying to figure out how to sort of start going back towards Europe. And we didn't really want to go to Russia for, just because we couldn't be bothered with the visa application process. And the crossing this border back into China, the northern part of China, which you kind of don't really expect to see or don't really think about it as being there almost between Mongolia and Kazakhstan. Yeah, we were really fortunate that the border opened up to as an international border. It was previously only sort of people that lived in neighbouring countries. It was brilliant, and it was a really happy moment for me that we were able to sort of make that crossing and take the route that we wanted to.
And it was so unusual for them to see tourists coming through that area because it isn't usually a place used by foreigners, if you like, that they wanted their photo taken with us because it was just such a novelty. I think we must have been in the first handful of people to have used that border. Then we went into Kazakhstan. We didn't actually do that much cycling, actually. We ended up taking transport to get to Almaty. But Chris was lucky enough to meet up with this guy called Taz, an Australian pilot who was living in Kazakhstan. And he took you up into the mountains.
Yeah, we did a sort of 2 or 3 day trip across the Asi Plateau, which was a good little sort of side adventure.
But from Almaty, we took a plane to Ukraine. So we skipped going over the Stans and Russia. And we landed in Kiev and then started cycling to Lviv. As you can see, the conditions were quite hard going. And this was basically early December. And it was just really, really cold. There's no other way to describe it. Really cold. And at this point, I was probably starting to find it quite difficult to just stay warm. I couldn't keep my feet warm. It was cold at night with a tent. I was just starting to lose my mojo a bit, and I realised I was at the point of thinking, oh, maybe if I get hit by a lorry or something, or if I skid and break my leg, I could go home. And then I think I finally spoke to you and said that I was thinking these things, and you were like, you can just go home, you don't have to carry on, you can just go, like, you know, it's okay. And I think I'd probably reached my point where I'd had enough at this point. It was almost 2.5 years at this point we've been on the road. So I actually stopped at Lviv and flew home and went home for Christmas. And you carried on your own for like the next 6 weeks across Europe, through Poland, Prague, Germany, the Netherlands and France, and did some sort of really long, like 150 kilometre days, sleeping out in the snow and just having that last bit of adventure on your own, actually.
It was important for me to finish by bike, and but it was like the last few months of the trip to go back.
Sorry.
What was interesting is that everything was starting to break now. Like the stove had broken and the tent zips had got frozen by me trying to cook inside the tent, and then they'd broken. And so actually I just had to rethink. I bought a gas stove to try and use that instead of the pressure stove, and it was taking me like an hour to make a cup of tea because I had to keep swapping the gas canisters out between down jackets because the temperature was dropping, and it was getting to about -20 at night in sometimes. But I sort of took this as a bit of a challenge to sort of survive comfortably, and I guess I sort of splurged a little bit in the last few months and decided that I just eat out for all my meals. So I got into a bit of a routine of waking up around about 9 o'clock-ish because it was a little bit warmer by then rather than really early. I'd cycle for a bit to kind of warm up. I'd have a massive meal, and I'd cycle, then throughout the day, and then have an evening meal, and then cycle again for another sort of few hours, and then find somewhere to sleep. This is before the tent really kind of gave out. But yeah, I really enjoyed it, and there was lots of challenges with snow and icy roads and that kind of stuff and navigation. But I ended up actually bivvying out for the last couple of weeks, and that was the most the easiest way to do it, actually, because I didn't have to worry about the tent. And then this is me coming back. We met a guy in China all that time ago, and he was a customs officer, really nice guy. And I had a 6 o'clock ferry booked, and that he managed to organise for us, and I missed it. I'd sort of cycled for pretty much like 2 days without sleep. I sort of almost fainted twice on the way to get to the ferry, and then realised that the ferry town was actually like 20 kilometres out of the town that I thought it was in. But I got there eventually, and actually I was quite lucky because there was an open ticket. So I think I came across sort of in the middle of the night. And then Martin, thank you so much. It was just, it brought a tear to my eye. He'd basically been waiting in his car at the ferry port for like hours, like, basically waiting for me. And he was there with a flag to sort of welcome me home to the UK. And I had to, he put me up for the night, and then we met up with Liz in London, and we had a big party with loads of friends came to meet us.
We had like a cycling trip back into Greenwich, didn't we? And then stopped at Greenwich. And then the good news is that
we got back and we moved to Manchester. Liz got a job, and then about 2 months after getting back, we had our wedding and got married. And now the first child came along pretty soon after that. Here are some pictures of the kids. You've just seen the youngest pop in and say hello. This is Sophie. And we're trying to get out as much as we can with the kids. This is a trip we did on Hadrian's Wall. Do you remember this trip? What did you think?
We did the coast to coast on Follow Me's, and then there was some off-road where the kids could unhook and just cycle. We did 100 miles in 4 days, which is pretty good for a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old, or a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old, I should say, at the time. And that's the whiz bang kind of whistle stop tour of our trip. And I think the one thing to say, I suppose, is the reason we said every relationship deserves a bike ride is it's an amazing way to get to know each other. You see each other warts and all, and it really is a great way to understand each other, to build empathy, to know that you can get through the hardest of things, and just to see each other like true colours, I guess, because for us, I guess, getting married, we wanted to know that we'd actually be able to make it and like each other enough to want to get through life together. And a bike trip's a really good way to sort of learn that in quite a quick way. So yeah, thank you. Thanks for listening.
Oh, thanks so much, guys. That is a brilliant story. We've known Chris and Liz for quite a few years. Tim and I, my husband and I, got to know them by reading their blog when they were on their trip, and they were one of the inspirations for us to go and do our own big trip cycling around the world. So it's brilliant to actually finally hear the story of their adventures. And what a great talk for Valentine's Day, and what a lovely message. And we've got loads of questions that have come in, and then huge amounts of love for you on the chat. I hope you're seeing it, like lots and lots of positive comments.
We've been looking at the slide. So,
I thought you might not have done. If you see, perhaps you can scroll through in a minute, but lots and lots of positive comments. I'll ask you some of the questions if you've got a few minutes.
Yeah, that's all right. Yeah.
We're going to. I think I said before, we can go until about 11:30, and then we need to get prepared.
Yeah, I mean, there are, just to sort of point out, we've skipped so much. I mean, sure. And there's so many bits and people that we've missed out. So do apologise if anyone that we cycled with, or that we've missed out. It was just there's not enough time to talk about it all, but feel free to ask questions.
So I'll ask you some of the questions that have come in, but before I want to ask you one question of my own, which is that obviously, so Tim and I, my husband and I, did our own 16-month trip. He's just next to me, and one of the things that we found in lockdown is that cycling around the world together was amazing preparation for being locked down together, because we've spent 24 hours a day with each other for several months, and seen each other at the better times and the worst of times. Would you agree with that? What's your experience of lockdown been? How does it compare to a cycling trip?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to like each other quite a lot to be on the road together, because you've only got each other effectively. If something goes wrong, I mean, we heard stories of guys saying, "Oh, I wish I could find a girlfriend to cycle around the world." And then they'd tell us what they tried, which is, making her cycle 150k in a day and sleep in a ditch and eat banana sandwiches. It's like, yeah, you might want to take a slightly gentler approach to get going rather than expect her to do that on day one, particularly if she's not a cyclist. And
vice versa, right? There's I know plenty of
girls. Sorry, the other way around as well. But I think that empathy for each other and being able to, the give and take of Chris often couldn't go probably at the pace he wanted to go. He'd have to adapt and wait for, or he'd go fast and then wait for me further ahead. But that idea that you've got, you're looking out for each other and that there is a lot of give and take is crucial. But also communication. We, I guess we can almost read each other to the point where we don't have to say, I can tell when he's not happy and vice versa without us even having to speak. Or if we're hungry, we had a thing where we carry each other's chocolate bars in our bar bags, so that if you started to get a bit grumpy, I'd just literally pass you something to eat, because it was just because the blood sugars were running low and you were getting grumpy about something. But rather than us having an argument, it'd just be like, oh, here you go, have something to eat and it'll be fine in a few minutes. And I think that's definitely helped with lockdown, because obviously having 2 small children and homeschool and trying to hold down jobs and all that. Yeah, I think we know each other so well that even if we do have a few quarrels, it doesn't take long for us to make up. And we generally don't actually quarrel very much, do we? It's pretty,
I guess,
pretty good.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if lucky is the right word to use it, but yeah.
I remember cycling up a hill actually once and thinking, God, if I can get up this hill, having a baby crying at 3 a.m. is going to be a walk in the park. And it's very different having a baby, obviously, as you know, but it does sort of prepare you for a lot of what life will throw at you, the level of resilience you need to cycle tour for a long time. I think that resilience really stands you in good stead. Plus the problem solving of, things going wrong and running out of money, or having a tire burst in the middle of Mongolia where there are no bike shops. There's a lot of problem solving to be done. So actually lockdown's probably easier than cycle touring in some respects, because
absolutely
we still have a lot available to us in terms of resources and shops. And
and it's
spending 24 hours in the tent in that sandstorm or whatever it was, and we had quite a few devices. We had a laptop each in the end, and that was like a compromise, because we were just we kept like not fighting, but fighting over the laptop. And in the end, we were just like, let's just get one each, and then we can both do blogs. And actually, it was more efficient because you get internet at a certain period of time. And so after all the devices had died, the iPod had died and everything, we just had to talk. So
we got to talk to each other.
Yeah.
It's good preparation for life for sure. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think the lesson of learning that grumpiness is usually equated to low sugar is a huge lesson to learn. Certainly we looked at each other knowingly then. Giving each other a flapjack at key moments is definitely very important. I'm gonna ask you some of the questions that have come in then, because there are a lot. So there's a couple of questions about equalizing your cycling speeds and whether the trailer did manage to help slow Chris down. Like I was asked this question recently actually myself by somebody, and we found that Tim's the faster cycler, but I've got more stamina. So I think sometimes like there's a stronger person in a couple, but the other one might be able to go for a bit longer. Like I don't know, do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it did slow me down a bit, and I think annoyingly probably too much in some places from my perspective, but I guess overall I didn't really enjoy cycling with a trailer. It didn't feel as free, and ultimately that's why we got rid of it. My bike just kept falling over. It was just hard to hold up, and I think in the end we just ended up rejigging things. We did try a different trailer. We tried the extra wheel trailer, and that Tom Allen used quite a lot back then during that time, and that was I think a little bit easier in some respects.
It was quite difficult on the rocky terrain though, in parts of Mongolia where we went up hills that were off-road. The trailer got really stuck with rocks, and I almost felt like I was going to have to come up behind you and push you up the hill, because it was just so unwieldy trying to get 3 wheels up a massive hill of rockiness than 2.
Yeah,
that was quite frustrating for you, I think.
Yeah, I don't necessarily know if the trailer actually made that much difference in terms of equalizing. I think more of it was just finding a equilibrium ourselves. Like I would often in the end cycle behind Liz, because then Liz would be able to dictate the pace, which was hard because Liz ended up being the one that's breaking wind all the time, but it was the only way that anyway,
I'm not sure you quite mean that, Chris.
No, but you know what I mean, don't you?
Yeah, you do.
It was the only way that I could essentially stay together, I found. And that if I basically went ahead, you just get into a rhythm, and then you end up. And on some of the hills, because I was carrying more weight, we would just make an agreement that I'll meet you at the top, or I'll meet you in a bit if it was a big hill. Because and like Jeremy was saying on Friday, I think it was, that you kind of got to, when you've got a lot of weight on the bike, you kind of got to go at your pace. And
on hills we definitely split up quite a lot, and it'd be like, I'll just meet you at the top of it, or meet you at a certain point, and then we could just both get into our own little groove, and I could stop if I wanted to and have a little rest or whatever, without going, oh god, I'm holding Chris up. But yeah, I think we just accepted that there was difference. I definitely got a lot fitter, and I had huge stamina by the end of it. I'd say I was probably the fittest I've ever been in my entire life, and I'd say I was pretty strong. I mean, the weight we were carrying through the Gobi was probably about 60 or 70 kilograms of weight on my bike. You probably have more.
Yeah, I mean, all the people
heavy.
that are into gram counting, we're the complete opposite of that. We just chuck it
caravan.
in, I mean, that was just our style, I guess. And I think from my perspective, it was about a lifestyle, and our lifestyle was being on bicycles. So I didn't want to be uncomfortable for that time. I wanted to have that extra thermarest,
extra laptop,
to be comfortable really, and to have that extra jacket, so that if it was really cold, I wasn't going to be cold. And it made you slower, and it brings, it's different, but that was what was
but yeah, 2.5 years on the road, you can't be completely stripped back for that amount of time, because it became about the travelling, and the bike was the mode of transport. It wasn't about like a Mark Beaumont kind of get across the world as fast as possible. For us, it was about seeing places and having that adventure.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember somebody commenting to us when we first set off, like, why on earth did we each have a little tablet computer? And it was, I mean, I was really surprised that it was even being questioned, but it was because because we were going away as a lifestyle. It wasn't as a, we weren't just doing a 2-day trip. It was going to be a long time. I think there's a couple of questions about your blog. Is your Bike About blog still live?
No. The subscription was accidentally not renewed, so the whole thing has been lost.
Oh no.
Well, we're still trying to get it back, but effectively I didn't renew the domain, the hosting, and it was in WordPress, and it basically got taken down by the web hosts because we hadn't paid to renew it. And we're still trying to go through everything, see if we've got a backup from WordPress of the actual blog posts.
I'm pretty sure that we don't, but if anyone's ever used the Wayback Machine, it is there. So at some point we are probably going to use the Wayback Machine to try and copy and paste 2.5 years of blogs back into something that's sort of usable.
Fail basically on that one.
Somebody in chat is saying archive.org has a lot of it. They were just reading some of it.
Oh, okay, brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, it is the Wayback Machine does have it. I've checked, there was I mean, I think halfway through the trip actually there was a guy, I can't remember his name now, maybe Ben, that was just a follower on, and it was nice for me. I mean, there were so many people that we were sort of friends with virtually on the bike trip, and they were sort of said, I've sort of been following your life for the last year, and I've just caught up, and now I'm doing it live. So it was really nice actually to have that interaction with people while we were away.
And I think we both discovered that we like writing as well, and we had quite different writing styles actually, but it was nice to have that record of what we did.
Absolutely. So we've got about 10 minutes. I'm going to just whiz through some of the questions. So there is a question about what UK family bike route would you recommend? And I'm going to suggest that whoever's that is by somebody anonymous, Chris is actually joining our family cycling panel on Friday morning. So I'm going to suggest that gets dealt with then, if that's okay. Chris now runs a business called Bambino Biking, which is a brilliant family cycling business. So if you do have specific questions about family cycling, then I'm sure Chris, I don't want to speak for you, but if you email Chris, then he'll be glad to help.
I mean, if you go to my website, bambinobiking.co.uk, you can book an appointment, you can have a virtual chat about anything really, so to do with family cycling.
Great. And somebody else has asked if you've got cycling touring with the kids planned, and I know you've done heaps of trips which you'll talk about on Friday, and I'm sure you've got more planned.
I think we had hoped to do something obviously last year, and then we're still hoping to do something this year because the kids are now at the point where they're 5 and 7, so they've got enough stamina. They've been on bikes since they were tiny, as you can imagine. So let's hope we can do some adventures this year.
Oh, I hope so. So do we. We're really hoping.
Yeah.
A couple of people have asked stuff about kit, so particularly the fact that it looked like you had quite a lot of variation in what you were carrying at different points. So did you keep on buying and selling panniers in the trailer, and like you obviously ditched the trailer at some point, so what did you do with it? And
I guess I'm never really satisfied with my setup, which amuses Liz because I would spend hours redesigning how I would carry things in my head on the bike. There's not much to do else in the day apart from think. So I'd constantly think about, maybe if we did this, it would be more efficient or better. So that was part of it. That was just my sort of nature of tinkering with things. And then also just at different stages, different weather conditions. We were trying to be a little bit canny with. So when we started off, we didn't have as much warm kit. And then going through, like when I was in China at the start, I sort of bought an extra sleeping bag and an extra roll mat. And then we sent some of that back. And then
we posted a lot of stuff home and then had stuff posted to us.
Yeah.
Like in Beijing, we had a whole box of stuff arrive in Beijing with lots of warm stuff for the Gobi and for Mongolia, and tents, a new tent. And I brought stuff back from the UK as well, because I obviously went home. So we actually swapped a lot of kit out, didn't we? And really sort of just rejigged it all, which obviously not everyone can do, but it definitely made it easier for us to be able to adjust things as we went, rather than just have to plan for every single country up front. Because you go from Malaysia that's 45 degrees to being in snowstorms in Mongolia and minus temperatures in Europe. So the idea that you can carry all of that for the whole time is probably not that.
And it's quite easy to do as well, actually. When there was, we were trying to get a new wheel for my bike once, as an example, and we were in Beijing, and I just thought, well, all the wheels are made here. And in the end, we ended up getting a UK bike shop to send to Beijing because, and it was, and they called me on my mobile in Beijing to sort of finish off the transaction. So actually getting hold of equipment and changing things was actually relatively easy. And I guess you kind of end up, I guess, over analyzing your equipment choice at the start, but I think just going with something and then working it out. Except in some places, like obviously if you're going through the Gobi, there isn't really many shops to sort of change things. But yeah,
anything to change anything.
There's a couple of some quick fire questions about like practicality. So there was a question about accessing money when there's no banks or ATMs, and whether you carried a lot of cash, and what happens if you lose your bank card.
We did have American dollars on us as backup the whole time, because it turns out that people are quite happy to take dollars no matter what country you're in, as like a trade. Most of the time, the ATM kind of machines were pretty good. China was tricky because we were only allowed to use the Bank of China ATMs, which are so we arrived into China and we only had a few yen, and we had to cycle for 4 or 5 days.
We actually ran out of money.
Because we couldn't get to anywhere that had a Bank of China. So that was a bit, if we'd have known that, I think we would have been able, if we'd have had, this is like going back 10 years now, and we didn't necessarily have the Google Maps information that we have now. And we probably could have planned that a bit better. But we were quite fortunate in that people would help you out. The hardest one was Mongolia, in that we got to a point where the banks wouldn't take our dollars and we'd run out of tugrig. And we had that whole big crossing to do from kind of Ulaanbaatar all the way to the Chinese border, which is about 2,000 kilometers. And we only had dollars at that point. And we had a couple of these moments of like almost like a guardian angel that seemed to be looking out for us. And neither of us are, religious, I suppose, although we might class ourselves as spiritual after this event. And that we were just going across this really open plain going, what are we going to do? We literally can't find anywhere. We got to the place where we thought there was a bank and they wouldn't take the money. So then we wouldn't change the money. And we didn't know of any other bank for about 800 kilometers. So we were just like, what are we going to do? And we started cycling, and then this sort of 4x4 came past. This Korean guy got out, gave us cold drinks out of his fridge in the back of his truck, sat down and had a chat with us, and then said, is there anything you need? And we said, I don't suppose there's any chance you could change some dollars. And he was like, yeah, sure. And just changed all our dollars into tugrig. And it was just like, what are the chances of that happening? It was like one of those moments where you go, yeah, I think someone's maybe watching out for us here, because that, the chance of that happening. So that was a bit of a hairy moment for us, where we literally couldn't problem solve our way out of it.
Those were the only 2 times that we actually generally sort of ran out of money. But I think the Mongolian one was a little bit more worrying than the Chinese one. I don't know.
Yeah, the Chinese one was just persevering, and you get there eventually. Just
because we knew that it was, I think in Mongolia we didn't know. And we ended up at a hostel, didn't we? And we had to ask to stay there for free until the banks opened.
Oh yeah, that was that in Mongolia as well, where we had to
persuade them. And then there was a hope that actually the banks would open. And we had to get some money, and we did, fortunately.
But Mongolia is a little bit like some of South Europe, where it's a little bit manana. So it's like, when's the bank going to open? And it's like, sometime today, maybe after lunch. And obviously we're desperate to pay the people that we'd been staying with. So there's a few of those moments that were a bit hairy, I think, but not too many. It wasn't, it was definitely manageable. Just a bit more forward planning.
Once you learn as well, like when Liz had gone back to the UK, you managed to wire some money to me.
Yeah.
Right, I can't remember what system we used, but there was some international money transfer system.
Like a Western Union.
And I ended up just basically getting about 3 months cash out from the bank. And I had a police escort because I needed the guy. He could speak really good English, and but he helped me basically go to the bank and get the money out. And I was thankful, because I didn't know if it was going to work and if they would understand everything. Yeah. And I used a lot of cash just during those times, because there was no other way.
I think we haven't said much about the kindness of strangers, but obviously that's a huge theme when you're cycle touring, particularly for a long time, is the amount of people that will help you if you are willing enough to sort of reach out and ask. Most people want to help you. Most people see you as, particularly on a bicycle, they sort of see you as being a bit more vulnerable, I think, and they want to make everything okay for you, and they want to host you in their country and look after you. So I think we got a lot of help. We probably haven't mentioned it enough, but we did get, a huge amount of help from local people.
Absolutely, it's the theme that comes up again and again at the Cycle Touring Festival. That
So
being on a bike makes you vulnerable and people look after you.
Yeah.
So I'm really sorry for those who've asked questions and we've not managed to get around to them. You've got heaps of questions, but I think if people want to get hold of you guys to either ask specific questions, or there's somebody who said that they live just up the road from you and would they like to get in touch with you to hang out, I think. So is the best way via the Bambino Biking website or on Facebook, or?
Yeah, I guess probably the best way is just through the Bambino Biking website. It's just chris@bambinobiking.co.uk. I don't know, can we answer these questions now when this ends, or will it disappear?
I think I need to end the webinar because we've got another webinar starting at 12, which I'll need to log on to quite soon. But the thing that I should point out is that somebody has found the latest copy of the Bike About blog, and Graham Ashton is downloading it from archive.org. So if you get in touch with them, you might have your blog.
We know Graham, he lives up the road. So
he does live up the road from you guys.
Yeah. For ages, but,
thank you so much. That's amazing.
So there you go. Hopefully,
crowdsourcing, problem solving, live on a Sunday morning.
Yeah. So sorry to those people who've asked questions and we've not got around to them. But like I said, just get in touch with Chris and Liz. I'm sure we'll be happy to answer them directly.
Yeah, I mean,
absolutely. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening and being enthusiastic. And,
thank you for joining us. What a super talk.
Okay.
Great. Bye.
Bye.